Okay, I wanted to make this video on the day it happened, but due to personal circumstances getting in the way, I never got the chance, and I ended up procrastinating for quite some time. But anyway, I wanted to make this video about an absolutely horrific story that I came across in the news last year. On December 23rd, I think it was, 2024, there was a woman, a homeless woman on the New York subway in Brooklyn who was murdered by an illegal immigrant. She was asleep on the New York subway train car, and this maniac, out of nowhere, he walked right up to her while she was asleep, and he set her on fire. I think what he must have done is he took some petrol or some kind of accelerant, and he set her on fire. He just stood in front of her while she burned to death, and didn't move or do anything. And what's even more horrific is that nobody else on the train did anything to help, or at least 3 people filmed it on their camera phones. There were police on the scene, but they just simply walked past like it's another day at the office for them. Nobody tried smothering her with items of clothing or anything to stop the fire from spreading. Nobody tried grabbing a fire extinguisher. In the video footage I've seen, people don't even sound that panicked. Other than the people filming, it's just everyone around is just so mesmerized and bewildered by what happened that nobody really does anything. And there's a lot to be said about what happened and why it happened the way it did. But anyway, it was if you've seen the video footage, well, that needs no introduction, because it may not be the footage of her death. It's probably not the most horrific and harrowing film footage to come out of New York City, but it's definitely maybe the second or third, compared with September 11th. And more recently, weeks later, they actually, after weeks of DNA testing and dental records, they actually found out the identity of the woman who was killed. And I took the time to read the article in the New York Times about her. And there isn't much information about her because for the years, I think, leading up to her death, she was homeless and indigent and didn't really have a permanent address. Her name, starting with her name was Debrina Kawam, Debbie Kawam. There's, based on what we know about her, I think she was born originally in New Jersey. She worked, I think, as a sales rep for a pharmaceutical company. There's a picture from her high school graduation photo, which I'm going to talk about in a moment because I have a lot to say about that. She, based on what little we know, she liked to have a bit of fun and she liked to party. I think she, she liked to have a good time. You can, what was I gonna? All right, again, there's so much we don't know about her, but based on some of the descriptions that were given in the New York, in the obituary and the, I'm gonna have to edit this out. We know that she used to be married, but at some point, her life began to fall apart. She ended up getting a divorce. Her father passed away recently, and somehow she ended up falling through the cracks, and she ended up homeless. as far as I'm aware, I don't think she has any family relatives left, or if she did, I'm sure they would have spoken up and talked about her, or she wouldn't have been homeless, because she would have had people to live with. There's a lot of things about this that are absolutely horrific, but I wanted to focus mainly here. I wanted to focus on the victim, Debbie, because we all walk past homeless people. Most of the time, we don't really give them much thought. We never spare a moment to think about there was a time before they ended up homeless. I mean, in some cases, I think it is. And we never stop to think about how they ended up that way. And we've learned to act like this because our experience tells us to be wary of people who ask for money. And some of us have even had moments where we have given money to homeless people and we've seen what they've done with it. We've seen them spend it on alcohol or do irresponsible, reckless things, or lie to us, and we've made a decision from that point on to disconnect from them emotionally and leave them to their fate. I'm guilty of this myself. And the thing is, I can see if I had been in a situation where I'd walked past a woman like Debbie, I probably would have done the same. Because that's what living in a big city does. It dehumanizes everyone. It reduces us all to atoms, atomized individuals, where we all look out for number one, and nobody gives any thought to people who end up at the bottom rung of the ladder. We just thank our lucky stars that we're not in their situation. But what's really haunting is the more you read about Debbie's life, what little we know about it, the more you begin to see that anyone could have ended up like her. And at this point, I want to take a moment to focus on her photo. You can see in her high school graduation picture, even though it's quite poor quality, it's in a black and white sepia, a very low resolution photograph. You can see that she's got that big, puffy, buoyant Aquanet perm in her hairstyle that was really popular in the 1980s. My mother has a photo album of her days back when she was in her 20s and her early 30s, before me and my siblings were born. And I've seen pictures of her and her friends, and many of them look just like that. So that's why it really hits at me personally, because basically Debbie Kawam, I mean, at least long before she ended up homeless, she could have been any one of us. I mean, take a look at yourself in the mirror for a moment. What makes you so sure that you won't eventually end up a homeless man or a homeless woman? You don't think it can happen to you? We're quick to judge people on what choices they make, or what things they do that help end up in them, that result in them becoming homeless and on the street. But we don't take a moment to consider that we're all inherently flawed people, and if we're not careful, or if we're just not lucky, the same can happen to us. And again, there's a lot we don't know about Debbie Kawam. We don't know what her life was like, or what choices she made. I think there was an outreach program to get her staying at a homeless shelter, but she didn't show up. I think. I'm going to have to refresh my memory on some of the details here, but my understanding, one of the main reasons why she was asleep on the subway is because you got to remember that this was in late December, and it gets really cold in the winter in New York City. It's plenty cold enough here in the UK where I'm from, but in New York, where there's plenty of snow in the winter, you can die of cold. You can die from hypothermia. if you're on the street. So that's why I think there's a lot of homeless people sleeping on the shelter, and sleeping on the subway in the New York subway. So Debbie Kawam is just one of many people who simply fell through the cracks. When you live in a big city like that, don't be so sure that it can't happen to anyone. Because if you're not rich, or if you don't know the right people, or if you encounter some profound personal misfortune, which from the looks of things, it seems like, it's really hard to say what happened that resulted in her divorce. But obviously she wasn't in the right place. Her life appears to have spiraled out of control. You don't just end up homeless on a New York subway overnight for no reason. And I sometimes wonder, would there have been any point in Debbie's life when she was busily working at her job for the pharmaceutical company where she worked? Did it ever occur to her that her life would turn out like this? That she would end up as a cautionary tale for what happens if you fall asleep on the New York subway? I don't think it ever has. There's all kinds of horrific stories, examples of people who, through no fault of their own and through pure bad luck, have ended up having horrific things happen to them. Such horrific stories that we read about them in the news, partly to make ourselves feel better about our own situation, but also to remind us of how mortal and how frail we are in the face of fate, and how cruel fate can be. Obviously, I don't think that's ever been the case. But the point I'm trying to make is that Debbie wasn't just some... I never personally, obviously, I never met her. I don't know of anyone who's ever known her. There's so much we don't know about her. That's part of the tragedy. But I'm sure, based on my understanding of human nature, what it means to be alive, I feel like Debbie's story, what happened to her, it could easily have happened to anyone in the right circumstances. It's an inescapable facet of living in a dystopic, dehumanizing environment like a large city where people are rootless and disconnected from each other, where families have been broken apart by financial and material concerns. The need. We used to live in families and in communities, but recently, in decades ago, there's been this push for people to leave the nest, to leave their families, to set themselves up in the big city to make money. And this has had, over time, an effect. It's turned all these big cities into Wild West environments where everyone's looking out for their own interests. There's lots of studies that have been done on how if you're in a small country town or a village, and we have an actor collapse on the side of the road, people will stop and they'll call the police or an ambulance or try to put them in the recovery position. But if the same thing happens in a large city, people just walk past her. It's I'm reminded of that scene at the end of the movie Joker, where Arthur Fleck says, "Those 3 rich Wall Street guys who got shot, everyone's crying about them, but if it was me, you'd just walk right past me." It hints at a certain truth in human nature, that we're inherently hierarchical And we have just little to no respect for those who aren't able to play the rigged game and survive it. Because for every successful rich millionaire, there's got to be tens or hundreds or thousands of casualties, of homeless people, of potential Debbie Kawams. That's the important thing you've got to remember. Another thing I wanted to point out is, especially with regards to her yearbook photo, her high school graduation picture. I already talked about how haunting and mesmerizing it is to see her, in that with that perm. But I tell you what it reminds me of. It's eerie and ominous. It reminds me of, there's this surreal crime drama from the early 90s called Twin Peaks. It's directed by David Lynch. It's considered to be one of his finest works. Now, the plot of Twin Peaks, I am going off on a bit of a tangent, but I promise you, this is connected to what I'm about to say. The plot of Twin Peaks is in this small isolated rural community of Twin Peaks, somewhere in northern Washington. There's a teenage girl called Laura Palmer, this pretty girl who's very popular in her school, who's horrifically, brutally murdered and sexually abused, and the town is completely torn apart by her death. They hire a local sheriff, I think his name's Harry Truman. Is it Harry Truman? Yeah, it's Truman. And FBI agent Dale Cooper. And they're both working to solve her case and find out who killed her. And at the end of each episode, we get a haunting close-up of her of the picture of Laura Palmer as the end credits play. And that's more or less the feeling I got when I saw the picture of Debbie. There's so much more that I want to talk about with regards to Debbie's death in terms of the conditions that made this absolutely horrific crime. Because, by the way, in case people have forgotten, what happened to Debbie was a crime. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a freak of nature. She didn't just catch fire on her own. She didn't spontaneously combust. The fact is, there was a maniac, a lunatic who did this to her, who was allowed to wander around without getting punished. And stories like Debbie's aren't even uncommon. And I'm going to make a whole video topic on that next, because honestly, Debbie's story would not have been possible in a vacuum. But the point I'm trying to make in this video is sometimes we need stories like this to remind ourselves that we're all just people. We're all trying to survive. We've all got an inherent instinct for self-preservation, which can, at times, it can make us cruel and indifferent to others who are not as fortunate. But all of us are at the mercy of the whims of fate. There's no hard and fast guarantee that something like this can't eventually happen to you. And you can't be in a position to point at other people and say that they did this to themselves, that it's down to choices that they made. Because by doing so, what you're effectively saying, the point you're making, is that you won't ever end up like that. And you can't be sure of that. It doesn't matter what things, however flawed a personality Debbie may or may not have had, she absolutely 100% did not deserve to have this happen to her. Debbie should have gotten help, real help. And if she had any family, if she had any extended family, they should have done something. They should have done something to help, because that's what family should be for. But I feel like the fact that hasn't happened just goes to show how atomizing and dehumanizing an existence 21st century life is. It makes me pause and reflect on just how many other people like her there must be. And the sad fact is, I think already people are beginning to move on. Or people have moved on already. Nothing has really been done about Debbie's death. People were horrified for a few days, but no public inquiry has been launched. As far as I'm aware, the governor of New York, Kathy Hochul, she hasn't even made any kind of announcement about it. Not on her I looked on her Twitter feed, nothing about what just happened. And barely in the same week, I think probably in the same month, maybe even in the same week, there's been like at least 2 or 3 people, one that I'm aware of, who were horrifically injured or killed by having somebody push them in front of the path of a subway train car. It really puts into perspective just. There's more I want to say about this, and more that I will say in a moment. But this is the kind of stuff that can happen. These are the times that we're living in. Anyway, obviously, there's no way Debbie can watch this video. She's not on this planet anymore, but and I'm not saying I do believe in the afterlife. I don't actually. I don't believe in God either. Lord knows, if there was a God and there was an afterlife, you'd think there would be some kind of reason for what happened, or there'd be some kind of long-term resolution or closure that would make her sacrifice mean something. But if she is in another place, wherever it is, I just hope it's better than this. And considering what happened to her, and considering the things that happen to people like her on a daily basis that I come across in the news, that's got to be a very low bar. Anyway, I'll see you in part 2 of this video series where I talk about more stuff.